of the war and really how Niagara became embroiled and the role that it served in the larger War of 1812, which was between Canada, or at the time the United Kingdom, and America. But before we start, we're going to quickly, Josh is here to offer this demonstration in French in case anyone would like that.
Hello, bonjour. Est-ce qu'il y a des personnes qui aimeraient avoir cette présentation en français?
If you didn't understand any of that, the answer is no. Well, thank you, Josh. All right, well, hello, welcome everyone to our featured talk today. Like I mentioned, it's going to be about Niagara's role on the War of 1812. I'm also going to branch out a bit more just to about what the War of 1812 was about, because I know a lot of people come here, it's not really a war that they've heard of. It's not very famous. And so I usually think that the best place to start with the War of 1812, kind of counterintuitively, is actually the American War of Independence, which is happening in 1776. Because in a lot of ways what the War of 1812 is about is unresolved questions about what was happening during that war. 1776, the American War of Independence. The United States gets their independence from Britain. They fight a very lengthy war over it. It takes them about 8 years, and at the end of it, they essentially kick Britain out of anything just past that river over there, the Niagara River, and they become their own independent country. At least that's the narrative that Americans really like to say all the time, because the truth is that Britain actually kept a lot of land in America for quite a while.
Yep.
Specifically, they kept all of the forts, or not all of the forts, but a good number of the forts, especially among the Niagara River. And they held control of those because controlling the river in this time period was super important. A river is basically your highway in 1812. There's no cars, there's no planes, there's no trains, and so the way that you move things very quickly is by the water. And if you don't have a fort controlling a water, it essentially means that the enemy could just shoot down your boats. They would sink and you'd have no goods, no trade goods that could move over long distances. And so somewhat to the chagrin of the Americans, the British held onto a lot of the forts that were in the United States of America. And they were forced to give up those forts in 1796 as part of a treaty called Jay's Treaty, which was about 20 whole years after the War of Independence had started. And that treaty basically forced Britain to give up all those treaties, and they promised to cede them back to America. Now, as soon as that treaty was signed, they started construction on this fort, which is Fort George, as you see it today. And they were doing that because they needed a position now that they had given up Fort Niagara to control the river. If you go up onto the bastion near our flag over there at any point during your visit today, you gaze across the river, you'll be able to see Fort Niagara, which is one of the main forts that I'm talking about here, which is the American position just on the other side of the river. So they start construction here to make sure they have something to counterbalance the presence of the Americans and make sure that there's something to defend the river in the case of a war breaking out. Now, the war eventually did break out in 1812, June 18th, 1812. And really, the chief cause of that war could said to have been Napoleon in a lot of ways. Britain was fighting a life and death struggle against Napoleonic France, who at this point had invaded most of Germany, Poland. By 1812, they were actually taking Russia, and it really seemed like Napoleon could threaten the very existence of the United Kingdom. And so in order to fight Napoleon, if they couldn't win on land, they started doing a bunch of embargoes. So they told other countries that they could not trade with France. The biggest one was what was called the Orders in Council, which was a British declaration that if any ship tried to trade with France, they would consider it essentially an enemy vessel, and they would withhold the right to shoot it down if they so chose. It also said in that same Order in Council that if ships were found having contraband on their boats when they stopped in British ports, that contraband could be seized. However, of course, the British didn't really define what they meant all the time by contraband, and very often that could mean the entire ship could be declared contraband and seized. And that was not great for the Americas. This whole policy caused somewhat of an economic downturn in the United States of America, as France was one of their biggest trading partners, and suddenly they were cut out entirely of trade with France. At the same time as these orders and councils were happening, the British were also doing a very somewhat nefarious policy called impressment. Now, impressment essentially meant that they would board American ships, they would seize American sailors, and they would force them to join the British Navy. Oftentimes they did this because they claimed that these British sailors were escaped members of the Royal Navy who had fled to America and were now living in America. But oftentimes these were just sailors that otherwise didn't have identification and can prove that they were themselves American and not British. Really, outside of the language you spoke, a lot of people didn't carry any form of ID in this time period, so it could be pretty difficult to actually prove your identity. All in all, the British took about 3,000 sailors. The exact number varies based on historians' estimates, but about 3,000 sailors they kidnapped from American vessels and forced them into the British Navy. Now this incident really came to a head in 1807, the impressment on what was called the Chesapeake Incident, at which point the British actually fired upon an American ship, which they believed was holding British sailors, and they boarded the American ship after taking it on its mast. They took the 5 sailors, and then they refused to actually take the Chesapeake, which the Americans thought was an actual slight to their honor, because usually if you take an enemy ship, you would actually take it for yourself. But in this instance, the British actually let the Chesapeake go, which the Americans saw was an impunity on their honor. It seemed like the British were just boarding their ships to prove that they could take American sailors if they really chose to. Now, the 1807 incident almost caused a war. People in America were really going for a war at this time period, but the tension somewhat fizzled out. It didn't really manifest in a war at that period. Now, the third really major reason for a war was that they were having conflicts with the indigenous people that lived to the west of the United States. In 1811, at the Battle of Tippecanoe, the Americans fought a battle against indigenous people living in the Ohio Valley, and they found British muskets. If you saw the musket demonstration, the exact same muskets they were firing there, in the hands of indigenous warriors. And they accused the British of arming the indigenous people to fight a war against America, which Britain wasn't really doing, at least not openly. They were certainly trading with the indigenous people, giving them weapons, but in no way was it some kind of concentrated policy to get a war started between America and the indigenous people. And really that was because they were scared that a war with the indigenous in America would spiral and involve Britain eventually, if it got to that point, which is exactly what happened. So after the Battle of Tippecanoe, which I mentioned is 1811, American hostilities were really flared up after this incident. Now the great irony of it is, of course, at that very same battle they found 1795 pattern Springfield muskets, which you might be able to guess is the American style of musket, but they coincidentally ignored that when they were accusing Britain of arming indigenous warriors to fight against them. Now, really, the whole situation with the indigenous people was flared up in recent years by a figure called the Shawnee Prophet, who was a prophet of the indigenous people, preaching a new religion, which took aspects of Christianity, but noticeably said that all indigenous people would take their land in common and that they would not trade it to the white man, no matter what, which was a big problem for America, who was trying to expand westwards. And so this Battle of Tippecanoe was really a battle against the Shawnee Prophet and this new system that he was developing. Now the brother of the Shawnee Prophet is the famous figure Tecumseh, who some of you might have heard before, who would be fighting with the British through most of the war. So you can tell that these kind of connections are being important as the war actually starts. Now, these figures are all kind of ramping up tensions, and then the final one, the kind of ignored one, is that Americans simply thought that they could invade Canada and conquer it if it really came to it. At this point, there was a lot of good reasons to believe that. Thomas Jefferson famously said that the conquest of Canada would be a simple matter of marching in and unfurling the banner of the Union. And so he basically thought that the people in Canada were starved under British tyranny and would really appreciate it if the Americans came in and invaded. And there was good reason to believe that, because in 1812, about 3/5 of all people living in Canada were recent immigrants from the United States, either late loyalists or loyalists, which are people that came up after the War of Independence. In fact, the major figures, the head honcho of this fort, Isaac Brock, and even Governor Simcoe, who was in charge of all of Upper Canada, were expressing concern that if a war happened, that the people living here would not be loyal to Britain, and they would actually be loyal to America. And so really there was a great cause for concern that this suggestion by the Americans might be true, that it might be easy to actually conquer Canada. And so for these reasons, on the 18th of June, they declared war. And at first, there was not a lot of hostility between people living in Canada and America. A lot of people had relatives who lived just across the border, so there wasn't a lot of hostilities. great examples of these could be in the beginning of 1812 for the Independence Day Parade, which happened in Calais, which is a small city in the United States, which bordered St. Stephen, New Brunswick. The people of New Brunswick gave the people of the United States a gift of gunpowder so they could use it as fireworks for their 4th of July parade. So you can see that there wasn't a lot of hostility, and in fact the border and trade was actually open. Of British soldiers that were fighting in the war, almost 2 in 3 of them were being fed by American contractors. So really trade did not stop. People were relatively happy to, or relatively not hostile towards the idea of war. Perhaps the single best example of this is that when the word of war was heard, the declaration of war was heard, at that exact same moment, the United States officers of Fort Niagara were actually here at Fort George in our officers' quarters having a dinner with the officers of the Fort George garrison, and they heard about the declaration of war, and instead of taking those officers prisoners or killing them, they actually escorted them down to their boats and expressed their regrets that they would now be fighting each other in as little as a week time, and they let them go otherwise unaccosted. So you can see that there wasn't a lot of hostility, at least in the early parts of the war. But as it got on and as the war got more bloody, there was oftentimes a lot more hostility. Now, the early American war effort was not really focused on Niagara, at least that wasn't the strategy. The strategy was to take Montreal, and Montreal kind of feeds into all of the river systems of Niagara. And so the idea is if you could take Montreal, you could starve out supplies, and the war would be over very quickly. Now this was pretty hard, as Quebec was where most people in Canada lived, so it was a much more hostile population. And also at the Battle of Lacolle Mills, the American force that was invading Montreal began firing upon themselves accidentally when they had a bit of confusion about where their troops were supposed to be, and they killed they killed a large portion of their own invasion force, which kind of stopped any efforts of that happening. Now, the second plan should have been to control the lake system, the lakes Ontario and Erie, but at this time period there wasn't any great navy on either side of the war, and so both the British and the Americans started building boats in Sackett's Harbor and Kingston respectively, but neither of them could really get an advantage in the naval system very early, and since they couldn't control any of those areas, the war really shifted to Niagara, which is where most of the fighting ended up happening. Now, the first year of the war was pretty disastrous for the Americans. The kind of first big battle, or first big offensive that happened was launched by the British at Fort Michilimackinac, which is far north of here, and that was just because the British heard the declaration of war before the Americans did, and they got the Americans to surrender because they didn't know that the war was happening entirely, and so they managed to get a position over top of Fort Michilimackinac and basically got a quick surrender. Very shortly afterwards, the British took Detroit, again almost without firing a shot. And so it seemed pretty disastrous, and the Americans really needed to start an offensive if they wanted to turn the war around. And so they started looking towards an invasion of Queenston Heights, which is just a few miles up the river from where we currently are. But there was a few big problems. The first is that the Americans expected somewhat of a larger invasion force to show up. There wasn't a big American army in this time period. In fact, the biggest U.S. governmental service was the post office. And the reason why they didn't have a big army is they thought that a big army was a threat to democracy. Because if some general who had bad ambitions took over, he could just overthrow the republic and proclaim himself king. So they didn't have a big army. And they were mostly relying on militiamen, who were just civilians living in America who had muskets or rifles or could give service. However, among the militia, the war was very unpopular, especially in any of the states that bordered Canada at the time. And as a result, they had a lot of trouble actually getting troops to come and fight. Before the Battle of Queenston Heights, a lot of the militiamen who actually showed up and were expected to be part of the invasion refused to cross the border because the U.S. Constitution said that militiamen had to give service only in the United States, and they thought that crossing the border would be a violation of their constitutional rights. And so what ends up happening at Queenston Heights is that they cross with a force of about 1,000 men. They have about 4,000 men still on the U.S. side of the border, and those 1,000 men start fighting the local garrison in Queenston Heights, as well as some indigenous warriors who were there to fight. Now, while that fight is happening, the Fort George garrison comes under fire from Fort Niagara. They fire cannons back and forth, and the idea of that was just to distract the forces that were here, make sure that they couldn't get to Queenston Heights. However, they eventually managed to detach themselves under Major General Isaac Brock. They go on about a 10-mile trek over to Queenston Heights, and they arrive. And at this point, the battle is not going too well for the Americans. There's two big problems. Really, the militia, like I mentioned, didn't want to cross. And this was made worse by the fact that as the first boats went over, they went over with fresh troops. But as they came back often bloody boats, sometimes maybe even with corpses in them. And so the Americans, who were then prompted to be part of the second wave, had a big morale impact that was scaring them. And also at the same time, a lot of troops in this time period were terrified of rumors that they had heard as children of indigenous warriors who would scalp you more or less if you were fighting against them. And they could actually hear the war cries of the indigenous on the Canadian side of the border all the way across on the American side. And so they were absolutely terrified of the idea of crossing the border, so they simply refused, stranding the entire American invasion force on the Canadian side of the border, just as Isaac Brock showed up with his army of fresh troops. And so they start engaging. Isaac Brock unfortunately dies over the course of the battle. He's shot directly through the heart, which was a great loss for Canada, as he was one of the few generals here that really took serious the idea of an American attack on Canada. He had thought it was a big threat after the Chesapeake incident. He dies fairly quickly in the battle. But as the battle goes on, it goes poorly for the Americans. They tried to surrender over 3 times, and the British refused to take their surrender, continue firing upon them. And only after all of those efforts, they get a surrender finally, and over 900 prisoners are taken at Queenston Heights. Now, Fort George itself was, of course, under fire, like I mentioned during that whole battle. At the back of our fort is our powder magazine, which is where all the gunpowder was stored. It's the original building left over from the war. During the course of Queenston Heights, it was actually hit by a cannonball, red-hot hot shot, which began to sink through the roof, and it had to be pulled out by pliers by a brave Captain Bigelow. And if they had stopped, if they had not actually managed to pull that out, it probably would have destroyed the whole fort as the powder magazine detonated. And if you managed to see the musket firing demonstration, you'd see over on our range that there's a big hill, a big earth hill over there called a berm. They actually put that in after the Battle of Queenston Heights to make sure that it wouldn't be hit by any future cannon fire. So this is really where you end in 1812. Things are not going great for the Americans on really any front. And in 1813, they really need to turn things around. Very quickly in 1813, on April 27th, they managed to sail a fleet over to York, which is modern-day Toronto, and they managed to burn most of the governmental buildings, which is considered a very big victory for them. And then about a month later, on May 25th, 1813, they begin a concentrated barrage of cannon fire upon Fort George. And so most of these buildings are wood. And so what they would use is called hot shot, which is a cannonball heated in a furnace. They fired off, and most of these buildings lit on fire as the Americans did that. Only the powder magazine remained after that barrage. And then 2 days later, on the 27th of May, they sail their army over, and they land in the town of Niagara-on-the-Lake, where there's a fight that happens. The British unfortunately lose the battle, mostly because they're completely outnumbered, and they try to retreat. And after that, the Americans basically occupy this fort for a period of about 6 months, and they build a new version of the fort on top of it. Now at this point, the war is going pretty poorly for the British. They've been turned around. Looks like things might not go too well. But luckily at Stony Creek, which is about 30 miles away from here, they managed to engage the American force when they were on the march, when they weren't ready for a battle. And they managed to win a big victory. They turn the American army around, and they start chasing them back to Fort George. Now things start to go very badly again because of the American militia. So they were convinced to fight at the Battle of Fort George by a bunch of temporary contracts, which promised them pay to come over here. However, by Christmas time, all of those contracts are expiring. And instead of being swept up by patriotism, the entire militia force more or less leaves and leaves this fort undefended, which means that the British take it back more or less without a fight. But the Americans on their way out decide to burn down the entire town of Niagara-on-the-Lake, which was considered a very poor move by most people involved at the time. And in response, the British will eventually burn down most of Buffalo, and in fact almost the whole coast of the Niagara frontier over there. So at this point, the war is not going too well for the Americans. There's some major reversals that are happening. Napoleon's been defeated. They know that troops are going to be coming over from Europe very shortly.
美國同法國係
And so they're starting
alliance
to withdraw out of the Niagara frontier entirely, which leaves Fort Niagara, which is across the river, more or less undefended. And the British managed to take it in a very easy battle, all things considered. One of the famous anecdotes of the Battle of Fort Niagara is that the British were sneaking up on the Americans. They managed to get the watchword to the fort, so they entered more or less unaccosted. And they came across the first guard outpost, where all of the American guards were playing a game of cards. They were betting some card game, and one of the soldiers asked, what card is trump? Meaning what card is the best card, and a British soldier popped out and said bayonets are trump, and they began stabbing all of the Americans and took the fort. I don't know how true that story is, but it was the British report that was given when they had actually taken the fort. Now along the same time, the British, they're freed up from Napoleon. They start laying siege to all sorts of the Atlantic coast. And so things are starting to ease off of Niagara, except for at Fort Erie, where the Americans are still holding strong. They still own some Canadian territory. But this is when famous events in 1814 kind of happened, such as the burning of the White House, which at the time was called the Presidential Manor. It was not white. The British showed up in boats. They burnt down most of the Capitol. And the reason why it's called the White House today, the U.S. White House, is because the burn marks of the building were painted over with white paint to cover the fact that it had been destroyed. At the same time, the siege of Fort McHenry happens, or around the same time the siege of Fort McHenry happens, which inspired the U.S. national anthem. The rockets' red glare, which they talk about in the U.S. national anthem, were British rockets. Somewhat of a new technology, which were mostly morale weapons. They would scream and make loud noises and be very bright, and so it clearly made an impression in the American soldiers, but they managed to win that engagement for the most part. And so by the time you're coming to the end of the war, I think really the whole war is somewhat summed up by the Battle of Lundy's Lane, which happens in Niagara Falls. It's one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, and really it ends with both sides bloodying themselves so much that neither can really claim victory on the battlefield, and who exactly won is still debated, which is a lot like the War of 1812 entirely. This peace treaty is called a status quo antebellum, which means that everything goes back to the way it was before the war happened, and really we pretend that the war never happened entirely. Most historians today really remark that the Canadians won their War of 1812 because we didn't lose. The Americans won their War of 1812 because they won one of the final battles, which really boosted their morale. And really the only side that lost the War of 1812 was the Indigenous people, who were greatly involved with what caused the outside of the war, but were not mentioned at all in the Treaty of Ghent, more or less. Originally, the British had a provision which they wanted to create a state for the Indigenous people in the Ohio Valley. That was their first term when they came to the negotiating table. But however, when Napoleon returned, they kind of got a memo from the higher-ups that they had to get their troops back to Europe. And so they were told to end a peace treaty really no matter what it took. So they basically struck that out. And by the end, there was no mention of the Indigenous people. And since there was no mention, that really allowed America over the next decades to expand westward and absorb most of that territory. And of course, on the British side as well, they had been fighting with the Indigenous people throughout the war, but there was so much bloodshed for the Indigenous warriors that by the end their states were left quite weakened, which left Britain to be able to absorb them and take over power from them quite easily in the decades that followed the war. So really, they were the true losers of the war when all things were considered. So on that, that's where this talk's going to be ending. If you guys have any questions, or if you have any questions about anything really, I'm more than happy to try and answer them. There is going to be a musket firing demonstration in about 5 minutes, just on the other side of this yellow building. And if neither of those things interest you, thank you for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.